Do you remember the old days, like a really long time ago, maybe like 9, 10 months ago, pre-COVID, when you can actually go to a beach, sit on the sand, and stare off into the ocean and look off into the distance? Well, if you can imagine that horizon, if you could see the sign on that horizon, at that very moment, that would be the rising sign. Your astrological chart is basically a wheel of 360 degrees divided into 12. And those 12 divisions form the houses of your astrological chart. And the first house is your rising sign. And despite what many people might think, the rising sign has nothing to do with the rising of the sun at the time of your birth, but more so to do with the rotation of the earth. So if you think about the earth rotating once every 24 hours, it essentially goes through each of the 12 zodiac signs, say every 2 hours or so. Essentially 1 degree for every 4 minutes. This is why it's so important to know the time of your birth in order to understand what your rising sign is. If you actually don't know the time you were born, you really can't ascertain the rising sign because it's actually determined by what sign is on the horizon at the very moment of your birth. Knowing your rising sign is really the first step in understanding who you are and how you interact with your astrological chart. Your rising sign has a lot to do with, your physical attributes, how you look, how others perceive you. It has a lot to do with your personality. It has a lot to do with your overall view of the outside world. And your rising sign essentially serves as a lens through which you see the outside world and the outside world perceives you. And each house has a natural ruler. And being that the rising sign is the first house, it is ruled by the first sign, Aries. So just like Aries, your rising sign is essentially the initial spark of your zodiac. It determines where everything else falls into place. And starting from the sign that's on your ascendant, you're going to evenly distribute all the other signs to form the rest of the houses in your astrological chart. So let's say, for example, you have Taurus as your rising sign. That would mean you have Gemini on the second house, you have Cancer on your third house, and so on and so on, unless you have intercepted signs. Okay, let's talk about intercepted signs for a second here. Because rising signs are determined by the rotation of the Earth around its axis, what happens is the further you get away from the equator, the shorter the rising signs will be. So let's say, for example, if you're closer to the higher latitudes, further north, like Canada or something, what you'll notice is that a lot of the birth charts will have intercepted signs because it takes the Earth a shorter distance to rotate around its axis. And what that tends to do is it causes some signs in your astrological chart to fall totally within another house and essentially doesn't have a house cusp for it to sit on. So what that'll mean is that you'll have two signs in your chart that don't have houses, and then you'll have another 2 signs in your chart that are doubled up. Usually intercepted signs can be really annoying for beginners. It makes things a little bit more complex. One of the techniques to simplify your chart if you have intercepted signs is to use the whole sign method or the whole house method. What that does is it puts every sign on your astrological chart in a house, regardless if it's intercepted or not. This helps for simplifying interpretations. It helps to help you to understand which signs fall into what houses. One of the things though that you can miss out on is the more subtle details of your astrological chart. Because you're generalizing and putting everything in one house with this method, you may miss out on the smaller details where some of the degrees may fall in a house, or you may even miss out on knowing exactly in which house a planet sits. And this can alter your interpretation of your chart. You can use that method, the whole house method, to simplify your chart, but again, think about what you may be missing out on. And just because you have intercepted signs doesn't mean you're not getting those energies from those signs or those planets. What it means is that understanding or discerning those energies and how they manifest in your life may be a bit harder. The energies are more subtle in their expression. So what it just means is that you really have to dig deeper into your chart to understand how those energies affect you. So if you run into your chart and there are intercepted signs, don't panic. Just try to use some of these other house methods, the whole sign method, as I mentioned before, and really just try to use that as a starting point to understanding how your houses fall into your astrological chart. And like I said earlier, because the rising sign is so important in really determining, a lot of those physical characteristics about you, whatever sign you have on your rising or in your first house will pretty much embody generally the characteristics of that sign. So as I mentioned before, if you have Taurus on your first house, you will take on a lot of the characteristics and qualities of a Taurus, both in physical attributes, in personality attributes. It's essentially having a second sun sign. So with Taurus on your ascendant in this example, you'll have maybe the same stubborn characteristics of a Taurus. You may have the same love for, appetite for food. You may have a love for, extravagant things or money. And even some of the downsides of Taurus, you may be a bit more stubborn than other people, right? So when you think about your rising sign, you have to also consider the sign that's on that first house. And because your rising sign does determine where all the other houses fall in your astrological chart, the sign opposite to that in your 7th house will be the opposite sign of your rising. So what I mean by that is if you have, let's go back to our example, Taurus on the first house, that means you'll have Scorpio on your 7th house. And because your first house or your rising sign is an angular house, it also determines the other 4 houses on those angles as well. So first house, 4th house, 7th house, and 10th house. Depending on your rising sign, it actually determines the rest of the signs in your zodiac chart. And understanding each of these signs, starting with your rising sign, will help you to understand what areas in your life are at work. And it's generally accepted that these 4 houses, these angular houses, the 1st, 4th, 7th, and 10th houses, are really important in determining a lot of the characteristics about you, how you interact with others, in the public life as well as in the home. And these angular houses are usually more, you want to give more emphasis to these houses because they really determine how you interact with the physical realm. So again, your first house determines how you appear physically, right, to other people. Your 4th house is your home life, how you express yourself at home. The 7th house, how you express yourself in relationships with other people. And the 10th house, how you express yourself in your public life. Assuming all of these houses are well aspected, you'll have different expressions of those houses as opposed to if they're not well aspected. And generally speaking, your first house will determine how you look and in your appearance. And depending on what sign you have on that house, you'll take on those physical characteristics as I mentioned before. So when learning about astrology, it's really important to know what sign is on your first house, your rising sign. Do you have any planets there? If so, what planets? Do you have intercepted signs? These are all important characteristics of your astrological chart that really help you to understand yourself as an individual. If you found this video helpful, let me know in the comments. Share with me what your rising sign is. And if you don't know how to find your rising sign, I'll put some links in the description below to guide you to some websites that'll help you identify what your rising is. Like and subscribe to the channel and stay tuned for more videos.